Chicago dog Wellington. 3 words that have been festering in the back of my mind for weeks, ever since my subconscious first conjured them. I've never made a beef Wellington, nor have I ever really wanted to. I suppose the challenges it presents make for a mildly intriguing test of skill, but I'm not about to go spend $100 on a center cut filet for something that I'm not that committed to. I'm not doing it, no. But Chicago dogs are good, and pork tenderloin is cheap enough. This idea made me laugh when I first had it, so maybe it would make someone else laugh too? And who knows, maybe the end result would be actually good? Only one way to find out, I guess. Alright, fine. Chicago dog Wellington is what's on the menu tonight. I doubt this will be the most delicious thing I've ever made, but it will be the stupidest, so let's find out what this even is. The first thing I'm doing here is getting my mushrooms ready for my duxelles. I really don't know how much I'm going to need, so I'm going to do this whole container's worth. I think it's about a pound. I trimmed off any bits of stem that felt particularly woody and rinsed any dirt off in a colander. I know some people would say that you should not rinse mushrooms like that, but I don't care. Mushrooms already have a lot of water in them, and the extra amount that they pick up from being rinsed is too small to make a difference. Besides, when you're cooking in this quantity, you'll see later that these are going to release an enormous amount of liquid. They're going to be wet no matter how I clean them. So now I'm giving each one a rough chop, and once I get through all of them, I'll pile it all up and just keep chopping until it feels like it's fine enough. You could probably do this in a food processor if you wanted to, but chopping's kind of fun. There, that looks good to me. So I'm going to throw all these into my biggest non-stick skillet. With the power of hindsight, I can say that maybe I should have chopped these a little finer, but it ended up being alright. So with those mushrooms in the pan, I'll add probably about 3 tablespoons of olive oil, and that's going to be my duxelle base. Now, since this is going to be modeled after a Chicago dog, I need to get weird with it. For me, one of the unsung heroes of a good Chicago dog is the celery salt. We'll get back to that specifically, but I want to layer in some of that celery flavor, so I'm going to finally mince up 2 stalks of celery and put it into my duxelle with the mushrooms. Also, in a slightly more traditional move, I'll dice up 1 medium onion and about 5 cloves of garlic and throw those in as well. Now that's all going to get a couple big pinches of salt and go over medium heat here for roughly an eternity. Like I mentioned before, mushrooms contain a huge amount of water, and when you start cooking them, they collapse down and release all their liquid. This is about 11 minutes into the cooking process here, and you can see how much water there is in the pan already. In order for a duxelle to work, you need to cook this until it's almost completely dry. Any residual wetness will just seep out later into our crust and make for a soggy, frankly pathetic Wellington. And no one, I mean no one, is going to tell me that I have a pathetic welly, okay? In all seriousness though, I ended up cooking this for about 40 minutes, and I probably could have gone even longer. This ended up working fine, but getting it even drier probably wouldn't have been a bad thing. So now you may be wondering, sure, I get the celery, but this is giving more Thanksgiving than Chicago dog. What gives? And you're right, I need to up the dogness of it all. For that, I got a couple more ingredients that I was saving until after the initial cook to preserve a little bit of freshness. First, I'm chopping up a bunch of dill to pay homage to the wonderful, albeit somewhat senseless, pickle spear you get on top of a Chicago dog. And next, a couple spoonfuls of pickled mustard seeds. I know these aren't a literal component of a classic Chicago dog, but they're going to bring a lot of yellow mustard flavor, obviously, as well as a big hit of acid. There are a lot of vinegary elements to compensate for here, so working a little bit of that into the duxelles should work out nicely. To prepare these, I basically used Adam Ragusia's method. I'll link his demonstration in the description. And with that, I'm calling this duxelle done. I'm going to throw that in the fridge to cool for a couple hours, so it'll be much easier to deal with when it comes time to roll. While that chills, I'm going to make a relish that will serve as the condiment to my Wellington. We're going to need some fresh veggies here, and this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to start with a couple Roma tomatoes that I'll de-seed and mince up pretty finely. I basically never run this move, taking the seeds and gel out of a tomato, but for this application, I think the excess liquid would be to my detriment. These tomatoes are also out of season and pretty lame, but for some reason I think that's kind of a benefit here. This is a class meets ass affair after all, and I feel like using a high quality heirloom would be missing the point. Next, I'll do half a cucumber, which, like the tomatoes, I will also de-seed for the same reasons and get that into a dice of about the same size. Then comes a few pepperoncinis. I know it should be sport peppers, I'm sorry, but I couldn't find any, and this was the closest I could do. Those get minced as fine as I can get them, and then I'll dice a quarter of a red onion. You could use white onion if you want. I'm mostly opting for the red for the color. What am I saying? No one in their right mind is ever gonna make this. Anyways, next I'll finally mince up some parsley because then I'll do a big pinch of kosher salt and a good amount of celery seed that I'll try to lightly crush between my fingers as I put it in. Like I said earlier, celery salt is an absolute must-have for me on a Chicago dog, and celery salt is basically celery seed ground up with salt. Then some red wine vinegar to taste, maybe a couple tablespoons. Mix that up, and that's ready to go for later. Alright, we're jumping forward in time a couple hours here, and it's time for the main event. This is a 1 pound pork tenderloin that I salted last night and left on a wired rack uncovered in the fridge. This is a step I would take for all sorts of meat, but I felt it would work especially well here since I'm quasi-simulating a hot dog. This kind of froze a bit. I guess my fridge is a little too cold. Oh well, should be fine anyways. I'm just cutting off the tapered ends so it's a little bit more uniform, and then I'm going to brush this with some yellow mustard. It's pretty common in a traditional Wellington to do this with Dijon, but obviously it needs to be the classic yellow mustard for this today. Next, I'll set up my rolling station. To do this, I'll lay out a couple pieces of plastic wrap. If I knew of an alternative, I would do that instead, but I'm not sure there's any getting around it here, I'm afraid. I'm going to overlap those a lot because I'm gonna need to wrap this pretty tight, and if the two pieces of plastic wrap don't stay stuck together, this is gonna be a disaster. Onto that plastic wrap, I'm gonna lay out some prosciutto. This is traditional and will also reinforce the cured porkiness that we're after. For the size of tenderloin I'm working with, I think a 3x2 shingling should get me full coverage. Next goes a generous portion of my duxelles that I'll spread as evenly as possible. Like I mentioned earlier, if I chop this a little more fine, I could have probably spread it a little thinner and more evenly, and I think that would have been better, but this will work regardless. I just need to make sure that when I roll this, there will be a reasonably uniform amount of it in orbit around the tenderloin, so sometimes it can help to gauge that by simulating the rolling motion as I'm doing here. By that estimate, I need about another inch to cover this whole thing, so I ended up using about 2/3 of the duxelle that I made, which means I probably should have started with about 9 to 10 ounces of mushrooms. Okay, after a good amount of stalling, sweating, shaking, crying, and throwing up, it is finally time to roll this thing. I do not want to do this and I'm scared, but I must keep going. I'm just gonna slowly bring this leading edge up and peel this plastic back a little bit, make sure it's even. Okay, so far so good. Just keep going, almost there, and done? Okay, that seems all right. Just gonna pull the plastic back around and give it a few rolls on the counter to get it nice and tight. I think that's good. I'll be honest, I did not have a lot of faith in that working, so I am pleasantly surprised right now. I'm gonna throw that in the freezer for a few minutes to stay cold and firm up a bit. Now all I gotta do is... oh no, the puff pastry. Now I'm really sweating, y'all. If you thought the hard part was over, well, guess what? You were wrong. But, once again, I must persevere through the agony to make this food that is totally worth it, really. I think I'll use half this puff pastry, that seems right. I'll plop that down on a lightly floured surface and get to rolling this out. I want this to have roughly the height of my prosciutto from earlier. That should give me enough coverage. I also want enough to have a couple inches of excess on each side. That should give me enough room to crimp without having to stretch anything around too much. That looks about right to me. All right, time to wrap. Just gonna pull this front edge up and start going for it. Make sure those loose ends come along. Don't want those dragging behind. So far, everything is okay. Just getting to the end here, and I forgot egg wash. Hang on, let me go grab an egg. Just gonna beat that with a little water. Okay, cool, got my glue now. Gonna paint that along this last edge here and finish rolling this up. And that seems all right there. Just need to crimp the ends a bit and cut off some of this excess. The rest, I'll just fold underneath to seal it up. And that looks good. That was surprisingly easy, actually. I was really worried about these assembly steps, but that didn't really end up being that bad. Sick. Now I'll transfer this over to a parchment-lined baking sheet and give the whole thing a good brush with that egg wash. I wish I was brave enough to do some sort of fancy design with this, but just the fact that it's working at all has been enough of a success. One last thing I will do though before this goes in the oven is I will coat it generously with poppy seeds. Gotta have a poppy seed bun for a Chicago dog. Now that's ready to bake, so it's going into a 400-degree Fahrenheit oven for about 35 minutes. 35 minutes later, and this is what we're looking at. A little bit of leakage, but really not bad, all things considered. The temp in the center is reading 127 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a little past where I want it, but I think it should be okay. One thing I know about this is that the meat is so well insulated in there that there's going to be a ton of carryover cooking. I probably should have gotten this out around 120 if I want it to reach 150, but nonetheless, I'll let this hang out on the counter for around 20 minutes so that it can coast up to that target temp of around 150. 20 minutes later, and we're there, so it's time to cut this open and see how we did. Trying to be careful cutting here because this is pretty delicate. Alright, let's get a better view. That looks perfect? I did a good job? What's going on here? I did not think this was going to work at all, let alone first try. I'm genuinely in a bit of disbelief here. Well, only thing left to do, I guess, is get a big slice of this and spoon on a whole bunch of that relish from earlier. Let's see how I did. Does this actually taste like a Chicago dog? Yeah, kind of. Obviously, it's different, but the bones are there. You can feel the influence. I can't believe this worked. And it's good food, too. It tastes good. This was fun. I was kind of dreading this, but it ended up being really fun and satisfying. I'm super excited about this, and maybe you should try this sometime? I don't know. I'll leave that up to you. But if you do, really let me know how it goes. I'd love to know. Thanks.